Yeah, so we were talking about how we're going to have a conversation today about, atheism versus
Right, atheism and theism, whether
theism.
or not there is some kind of common ground going on. Because, like, I saw your debate with Jacob Hansen on atheism versus theism, what explains the universe better. And I don't know, I kind of feel like I myself I'm in this weird, awkward position where my most favorite philosopher of all time is Friedrich Nietzsche, who is so famously atheist that he said God is dead. So I've really gotten to really appreciate a lot of atheistic views and how to explain the universe from that point of view. But at the same time, I still have this deep uh, belief in God. I can definitely see where atheists are coming from. It's very easy to look at the Bible and be like, yeah, this is just a bunch of fairy tales from a God who likes to kill babies in Egypt or something like that. And so it's very easy to dismiss all of that and focus on the here and now, what you can understand. So I guess that's a little bit of what I'm coming from. I'm a little bit like I'm not entirely sure how to balance all this out. But so anyway, we were getting into your backstory about how you went from a believing Latter-day Saint or Mormon to agnostic to theist. So go ahead,
Yeah,
just briefly.
yeah, sure. So, yeah, I was born and raised in the church, and I had a lot of significant spiritual experiences along the way, starting from a young age, lots of spiritual experiences. My confidence in God's existence just kept rising until I felt it was at 100%. I'm like, I have so many experiences, I can't deny any of this. You know what I mean?
Right.
But then
What could you give us an example?
yeah, so like at 9 years old, I was playing hide and go seek, but my family didn't know where I was and they were all worried. They're like, Seth is gone, he's been gone. And I was really stubborn. I'm like, I'm gonna wait here forever until they find me. And they're freaking out. They're like, where's Seth? Like they didn't understand that I was playing a game. And I had this spiritual feeling like, you need to go inside. I was like, why would I do that? I was 9 years old, right? I'm like, I want to win this game. And then the feeling, you need to go inside. So I go back inside my house and my family just finished a prayer. Like they had a family prayer and they're like, please help us find Seth. And I'm like, here I am. Like perfect timing. I was like, that's such a great coincidence. Like,
Right.
how is that not a miracle? You know what
So
I
how
mean?
would you explain that now?
Yeah, so it's kind of an intuitive thing. A lot of it is luck because there's so many spiritual experiences that are failures, right? There's a
Right.
lot of times where, like on a mission is the perfect example. How many times do missionaries feel inspired to do something? They do it and it doesn't work,
Sure.
right?
I mean, I had this weird experience on my mission where I had a dream about this certain lady, and sure enough, she was in our phone book or the missionary thing that we use to keep track of people. And so I gave her a call, but nothing came of it. So I don't know if that was like a weird coincidence or what. But yeah,
You,
it didn't work out the way that I envisioned it in my head. So I don't know how to explain that.
yeah, one of the biggest things that helped me like transition to reinterpret my experiences was understanding selection bias. I think a lot of it is there's in our heads, we've got the selection bias. And how I look at it is we've got thousands of experiences. And
Right.
then some of those, a outlier, like a minor portion, they coincide with what we want, right? It's like I've got 1,000 spiritual like impressions, and only one of them works out in a way that's impressive. Well, if I just isolate and narrowly look, oh, when I was 9 years old, it worked out perfectly. Then I'm like, oh, my spiritual experience, it's super reliable. But then I go on a mission, I'm like, well, I have thousands of these, and only one out of 1,000 is useful. Like if I
Right.
start to expand the scope of analysis, it doesn't look impressive.
No, not really at all. So continue on with your story.
Yeah. So by the time I'm 23, 24, and my life is starting to like get into a rocky place. And I feel like the revelation I'm receiving, like I'm hearing voices from God, I'm having dreams of the future, every spiritual experience is I'm burning in my bosom. It's all guiding me. Like all of these different experiences are all pointing me in one path. And so I'm following this path. I think that God wants me to go down this path, but it's a horrible path for me. And it gets worse and worse over time. And I keep asking myself, why am I going down this path? Why does God want me down this path? And it was making me miserable. It was making me suicidal. I'm like, I can't do this. I'm like, and I finally had the epiphany. What if God is wrong? What if God is wrong? Like everything about my being is saying this is the wrong path, but my revelation is saying this is the right path. And I eventually said, God's got to be wrong, because this is like everything about this path is screaming it's the wrong path for me.
It was making you more miserable the more you went down it.
Exactly. And I couldn't reconcile it. And so I dropped God.
Just completely dropped him out of your life. All right.
Well, here's the thing. I still felt like he existed because I had so many experiences. I'm like, he must exist, but he's either fallible or he's malicious. He's not, like, the definition had to change.
Sure. He certainly wasn't all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving. He was just kind of, is he just in the back of my mind? Is he just the bicameral mind kind of an idea?
Sure. Yeah.
I definitely feel like I've definitely had lots of experiences in my own life where I feel like it just had to have been God. And then you kind of think back and you're like, I don't know, maybe that was more coincidental than some all-powerful being making something special happen. But you know, at the same time, I feel like there's still lots of things that we could get into in a little bit that still make me wonder. But at the same time, I feel like there's so many contradictions in the idea of God as a concept itself that you kind of wonder if you should just dismiss the idea altogether.
Yeah, that's basically the path that, like, it took me 6 years to, like, process all of this. Like, my confidence in God's existence went from 100%, 90, 80, 60, like every year it kept dropping. And at the end, I was like, it's such a messed up concept. Might as well just do away with it.
Basically. All right. Awesome. Yeah. So let's start talking about dialectics. I mentioned to you Hegelian dialectics, and you sent me a list of maybe 40 or 50 other dialectics.
Yeah, I went overboard with that list, didn't I?
Yeah, I mean, probably. I think, but mainly sticking to a couple of dialectics. I mentioned Hegelian dialectics, which includes you have position A and position B, and they'll fight each other, but then ultimately they'll come to a resolution of position AB. And then I also enjoy like Socratic dialectic. I guess you could probably call Nietzschean dialectic. There's all sorts of different dialectics, but I think mainly I like to focus on Hegelian and Socratic, where it's sort of like, with like Socratic, it's just kind of like somebody just says something, and then you're Socrates who just tries to nitpick every little thing about that position without really fully. Now the downside is he often didn't give like a really concrete position for himself. It was mainly just, you're wrong in these ways, and I don't have a better solution. Yeah. But I think that's where Hegelian dialectics improves, is where you really want to come at it from a good point of view. You still want to have that Socratic mentality of I don't know anything, but where you're open to everything. But you still want to stand for something, because if you don't stand for anything, how does that quote go? If you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for anything. Kind of an idea.
Yeah.
What totally. Do you think? What kind of dialectics do you prefer?
Yeah. So first of all, to the Socratic thing, I think that oftentimes atheism goes down the Socratic path, where it's like the atheists are like, oh, we're not going to posit anything. We're not making any positive arguments, but we're going to critique the crap out of your stuff. Right. And I don't really like that approach. I don't like the negative approach to atheism. I like the more, positive. I'm talking philosophically positive approach to atheism.
I definitely think that's a cool thing about your channel in general, is there's too much hatred out there where people just completely dedicate themselves to being anti-Mormons, atheistic anti-Mormons, that like they don't like, I don't know, for example, like who is Jacob's brother again, who runs his own anti-Mormon channel? I can't remember, but like one thing I find interesting about him is he's so anti-Mormon that he's more willing to take other Christians that are against Mormonism's approach than to just sticking to a core, like, central atheistic idea of opposition. And then even more so than that, it's just kind of a bad idea in general to be so anti anything. You definitely want to stand for something, and you definitely want to be able to provide your own explanations for things that maybe theism falls short of, not just critiquing theism the whole way.
Exactly. It's kind of like the whole meaning crisis thing. It's like you can't just take away a belief system. You ideally you want to have something better to replace it. So a lot of my channel is trying to build.
Otherwise, you just lead people down the path of nihilism, and they're like, okay, so there's no point in anything. You're just going to you're just going to take away my platform, and I'm going to fall into the abyss.
Right, and that's a danger and a type of suffering that I want to help mitigate. I want to provide a framework where it's like, oh, this makes sense. I can do this under atheism.
Okay, awesome. So give us an example of that, like how you can use atheism to maybe explain something that theism falls short of.
Yeah. Okay. So I talked about this with my brother on a podcast. We discussed The Giver, the book, the movie, The Giver.
Right. And I like that movie simply because it has Taylor Swift in it, and she's
that makes it nice. But my brother, he asked me a very poignant question that is relevant. We discussed like like a carrot of motivation. That like the donkey, he follows the carrot and that guides him in his meaning of life, right? And so for a theist, like the concept of heaven would be like the carrot that guides the theist through life. And my brother, he said, what carrots do atheists have? And my answer to him was, just like a theist, they fall in love with the idea of heaven. Well, let's like break down what is heaven.
So they sort of fall in love with the idea of heaven and then fall out of love with the idea of earth.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, exactly.
Right. That was one of Nietzsche's main criticism of Christianity.
Exactly. Very astute point. So when you like look at what heaven is, you could basically simplify heaven. It's a futuristic state of infinite well-being for an infinite number of people, something like that, right?
Well, not too many if you're a Protestant Christian.
Yeah. Play with the variables based on your theology.
According to them, very, very few people are going to get into heaven.
Okay. Lots of well-being for lots of people. Is that better?
Sure.
Yeah. So heaven is this futuristic well-being utopia. And so the atheist can basically latch onto something similar, but say, we're not going to build this well-being utopia in outer space or in this other dimension. We're not going to do it in metaphysical space. We're going to do it in reality. Why are we wasting our time for an imaginary utopia when we can build a real utopia?
Right.
And
Okay.
so you basically switch from an atheist perspective, heaven is fake well-being, and you focus on real well-being.
Sure. Well, I definitely think this is, even as a theist, I often wonder myself about the whole concept of heaven. All I know for sure is the here and now. The future is uncertain. The past is in the past. Really, the only thing that matters is the present. And so if you're not happy, really, I mean, it's just an ancient philosophy that if you're not happy in the present, then there's no guarantee you'll be happy in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so you just gotta, and it's surprising how people don't believe it, but there have been tons of studies how you literally just need to, once you put yourself in that heavenly mindset, you bring heaven down to earth, and you don't need to wait for the second coming to happen. You don't need God to come down and be like, okay, here's heaven. You just start doing it right here and now.
Exactly. That's why I think I'm biased to think the atheist perspective is more productive, because they're actually,
you can't wait on a second coming. You just have to put your mind to it right now.
Right. And I think oftentimes the theist, they think, well, your well-being in this life is not important. Your well-being in the next life is what's important. So I'm not focused on curing hunger and poverty. I'm focused on conversion, because conversion solves more well-being than, solving hunger or malaria. You know what I mean?
Right, because you're focused on getting people through those pearly gates. Primarily.
Exactly. And so your efforts and your resources are warped towards this imaginary well-being.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So let's get a little bit more into your position. What do you think is the number one greatest argument for atheism?
Well, you asked me a question before that I didn't get to. Do you want to backtrack?
What was that? What was that again?
The question you asked me before was, what is your favorite? Something like, what is the type of dialectic you like to focus on?
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's get into that first. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So kind of the way I view the most ideal type of dialectic that I would like to focus on is a dialectic based on a concept of teamwork and partnership, right? So like oftentimes in a debate, you're trying to destroy each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the best type of dialectic is when you're not trying to destroy each other, you're working as a team, and you have the same goal of getting to truth and goodness together, right? And you come with different perspectives and different contradictory ideas, but you both recognize that you have the same goals, and you embrace criticism, right? You want critique because maybe the critique can help you get to the goal.
Right, definitely. And that's what I think is the fundamental idea behind Hegelian dialectics is all about. And that's definitely how you get to, some kind of world peace, is to get to that. I remember you made a video that I just barely watched where you talk about a one world government where we completely eliminate all tribalism, and it seems like you were trying to get to that kind of idea.
Yeah, that's kind of what seems like the best approach to solving all of this, all the warfare, division. That's kind of, it seems like transcending tribalism for this universal brotherhood. If we're all treating each other like brothers, then we can get happiness from each other's happiness, and that gives us this unific utopia, right?
Mm-hmm. That's going to require a lot of work if we're going to go for something like that, because the world is so divided right now.
Absolutely.
It almost seems like a pipe dream, if I'm going to be honest. It would be such an ambitious goal. I don't even know where you would start with something like that.
Well, just consider me to have adopted the Naruto philosophy of, I have the audacity to dream big.
Yeah, you watch too much anime. Those anime protagonists, they're always, from Naruto to Luffy, they're all like, I'm going to be the best, and I'm going to get world peace, and super naively optimistic. And that's kind of a part of their charm, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But, I feel like if everyone thinks it's impossible, then our probability is like 0. But if we're actually thinking it's possible, then we'll actually try. And if we actually try, maybe it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Maybe, just maybe. All right. So getting into this atheist-theist dialectic, let's begin with the atheist proposition. What do you think is the number one argument for atheism?
Oh, number one argument for atheism.
Like, if you could just, because I feel like one of the biggest problems with most people, and this is the biggest problem with the the CES letters. It just throws a whole bunch of arguments at you all at once, hoping something sticks. But I think if you're going to convince somebody of your position, I think it's best to start with one solid idea and then build out from that one solid idea instead of throwing a whole bunch of stuff out there and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, so my perspective, I don't know, maybe you noticed from my debate with Jacob Hansen, I view persuasion and epistemology as an accumulatory methodology. And so I think the accumulation is the proper approach, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I'm very skeptical of these single arguments. Yeah. You can make a singular logical deduction for flat Earth. You know, you can make a lot of silly arguments, and in isolation, they look kind of impressive.
I mean, in general, I think we need to put all the flat earthers on a spaceship, send them up off the planet so they can see for themselves, and then just have them never come back to Earth.
And then the rest of the flat earthers they're bought and paid for. There's always a narrative.
No, we send all of them, so there aren't any more on Earth.
Oh, okay, yeah, we just got to do enough investment.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's why. So I guess I'm very I'm skeptical of the isolated epistemological approach. But yeah, I think probably the most damaging thing for traditional theism, and like I come from a Judeo-Christian culture, so I view it through the lens of what's damaging to the Judeo-Christian paradigm.
Sure.
So I think evolution is probably the most damning thing for the paradigm I grew up in.
Okay, so go on and get into that. So you think like when you look at the book of Genesis and you look at evolution, you just think evolution just explains things so much better than Genesis.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty much all of science is damning for religion, but evolution is particularly damning because our existence is pretty impressive, right? We're these impressive creatures,
right?
And we look out into the world and there's these impressive animals, and the earth, it's kind of impressive, and there's a lot of impressive things going on, and without an explanation, it's like something must have designed all of these impressive things, right?
Sure. And that's where theists would come in and say, "Oh, it was all God. That's why we're so perfect. That's why the universe is so perfectly fine-tuned as it's for us." But your approach is evolution explains pretty well why we feel like we're so finely tuned, is because the universe wasn't created for us. We were created for the universe, kind of an idea.
Yeah, basically. And I think that the evidence for evolution is so strong that it's like an impossible hurdle to get over. You know what I mean? Sure. It's like anyone who's versed in the science of it is going to be forced to accept that this is the explanation for what's going on. And once you get to that point, it's kind of the God and intelligent design becomes superfluous. We don't need those concepts. We've got the explanation.
Definitely. So I think here's something that I would bring up. Have you seen the movie Noah?
The live action.
Yeah, the one with Alfonso Cuarón, and it stars Russell Crowe.
I'm not familiar with the actors' names, but I think I've seen it. It was kind of a pessimistic
look.
I'm
just getting to that, Mom. Thanks. She just wrote me this letter.
I can't see it.
It says, of course, the church believes in evolution. I mean, we teach it at BYU. But anyway, so I was getting into Noah because in Noah, he tells this creation story. Mm-hmm. And while he's telling it, it shows a creature evolving from a fish to an ape to a man. And so it's sort of like, how do we combine Genesis and evolution together? Kind of an idea.
Yeah, Genesis doesn't match. Like, if you have rose-colored glasses and you try to like look at it very loosely, you can be like, oh, it kind of makes sense. But if you start to get particular, it doesn't make much sense.
All right, so get into that. Like, there's something about Genesis that doesn't allow evolution to be in there because it's all straight from God, or what's going on there?
Well, the biggest absurdity is plants coming before the sun. It's like that's such a dumb mistake. It's like you have to do mental gymnastics to make it make sense.
Okay.
Like, which is the better explanation? God is like doing this weird order of creation where he puts all this magical photosynthesis in the air and then does the sun afterwards to replace his magical photosynthesis. He just does everything out of order for no reason because he can, because he's just flexing on us. Or did ancient people just write a little narrative and these ancient people are ignorant and they got the order mixed up because they were ignorant? Which is the better explanation?
I mean, I tend to come from the proposition of maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know. I guess I should probably get into this a little bit more, but my view of dialectics would be a yes and kind of an approach, not a it has to be this and not that. So, like, for example, a Protestant Christian will say, Mormons aren't Christian, to which I say, yes, and neither of you, while at the same time quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, there is only one Christian and he died on the cross. Or you might say an atheist says there's a problem of evil, to which I would respond, yes, but it's not God's problem, it's our problem. Kind of an idea.
I love that approach.
Yes, and kind of an approach.
I absolutely love that approach, but I would caveat it. I just the caveat is basically you want to think about that approach, but to not be stubborn with that approach. You know what I mean? Like,
right,
maybe yes and is not.
There's definitely like some things that you'd want to drop along the way, of course, but I think it's a starting place to getting to the absolute truth, where sort of an absolute unity, where you're not completely outright dismissing what your proponent has to say. You sit down and you think, okay, how can these things coincide with each other, and then after that figure out an alternative.
Yeah. As a methodology, I think it's very wise to
take
take
what's
that
the
step.
What's the best of both worlds?
Sure. So how would you yes and the divine photosynthesis?
The divine, I don't know. It's definitely an interesting idea. I kind of think a lot of things in the Bible is maybe a little bit more symbolic than literal. Like, maybe the idea of the creation is to denote least important to most important as far as God's creations go, because man was created last because that's just how great man is. Or, some people take it a step further. Oh, but then God created Eve, so women are superior to men. I don't know. That was a viewpoint that Gordon B. Hinckley held. He may have been a bit of a simp, but in any case, I think it's an interesting idea. So that seems like an idea that has been propagated around, is that it's more so about the order of least important to most important than, oh, God forgot photosynthesis is a thing, so he's got to go back and create the sun for the plants.
Yeah. Symbolism seems to be growing in popularity as a hermeneutical approach to scripture. It seems like Jordan Peterson is one of the people championing this approach to interpretation. Well, I'm largely skeptical of this approach, but I'm not, like, if people want to go that approach, like,
sure,
I guess it's probably preferable to dogmatic literalism. So if you're going to transition, fine, go right ahead.
Like, it's if you're going to take the book of Genesis absolutely literally, you would have to be a flat earther, because they believed the earth was flat back then. And so they were just sort of like interpreting things like maybe there was some being like communicating to them and inspiring them, but they ended up, like, because they're imperfect humans, they ended up writing it down in their imperfect language in an imperfect way that they would understand.
Right. So to the whole symbolism argument in general, I would say the New Testament scripture, God is not a God of confusion, is it's my go-to counter argument. It seems like when you reduce things to symbolism, then you get into this postmodern interpretation landscape where, you know, everyone's got their own interpretation, and it's obvious that Christianity suffers from an interpretation issue since there's thousands of denominations with their own interpretation. To me, that looks like confusion. And if God is not a God of confusion, why did he design the scriptures to create all of these interpretations?
Sure. God is not a God of creation, God of confusion, but of peace, kind of an idea. And so I definitely think that's definitely a hard approach to take. That's why I think maybe the ancient authors thought they were writing down how creation worked when they were just kind of writing down an imperfect way of how it worked. And it's sort of like, if there's an all-perfect being out there, there's not really much he can do unless he wants to take away our free agency and make us robots, if he's got imperfect humans to work through. But then at the same time, you kind of have to wonder, if man is created in the image and likeness of God and man is imperfect, does that mean that God himself is imperfect?
Say that one more time.
So the scriptures say that man was created in God's image, right?
Mm-hmm.
If man is imperfect and he was created in the image and likeness of God, does that mean that God is imperfect in some ways? Or maybe we don't fully understand what it means to be perfect.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think atheists would be like, yes, and theists would be like, no, and you just play with how you interpret it, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, that's just kind of how my mind works. I'm willing to question anything and everything. I think everything that humans do, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who thinks, oh yeah, humans are completely perfect. And so I think if humans are imperfect, I think we can get some things right, but there's also going to be a lot of things that we don't get right.
There is, you mentioned free will, and I don't know, but if you know this, but I'm in the camp of believing that there's no such thing as free will.
Sure.
And so in addition to evolution, I think no free will is also damning for religion, because a lot of the religious axioms go back to free will. Evil is because of free will. The atonement is because of free will. Sin and righteousness are because of free will, right? If there's no such thing as free will, it just destroys all the axioms of Judeo-Christian religion.
Right, because if there's no free will, man is not accountable for his sins.
Exactly, in a cosmic sense.
And there would be no reason for an atonement of any kind.
Exactly, or
whether
redemption. Yeah.
Okay. So what would you propose as a argument against agency then?
Yeah, so the simplest way to put it is the laws of physics are deterministic, right? So you are made of things that follow the laws of physics. Your brain produces the decisions that you do, and your brain is made of materials that follow the laws of physics, and therefore your decisions follow the laws of physics.
So there's nothing that we can do to defy the laws of physics overall.
Exactly.
I can't magically say I'm Superman, I'm gonna go fly, kind of an idea, but can't that? So we're subject to the laws of physics, but does that mean that we absolutely have no free will? Because I feel like you could still have free will over some things. Like I can have free will over what pants I wear.
Yeah.
I don't think physics cares what pants I wear on what given day.
Are you sure?
So, what are you getting at?
Okay,
You're telling me there's a physics god who demands I don't wear blue jeans on one day
Yeah. Well, no.
I always have to wear one specific type of pants.
So like a lot of people appeal to these types of examples. And like if you're just like having a simplified analysis of physics and decision, it doesn't make sense that the two are connected. But there's like, you know, like a bunch of layers of abstraction between the decision and the physics. If you go down the chain of causation, it like I think that if you follow the chain of causation, it makes sense that your how you wear your pants is connected to the laws of physics if you go step by step.
I'm still not fully following, but
Okay. So let me just okay, so if there's I'm going to make an analogy between brains and a flowing water in a river, right?
okay.
A river, the water follows the path of least resistance, right? Gravity is pulling the water down the path of the mountain. It's going down the mountain, and if there's a rock in the way, it goes around the rock, path of least resistance. The laws of physics are guiding the river, correct?
Okay, so I chose my pants because that was the law of least resistance.
In your brain, the calcium ions. Calcium ions. It's a electrically charged particle, right? You've basically got a chain of electricity, and the electricity is following the path of least resistance through your brain, just like water in a river follows the path of least resistance. So if the river goes around a rock, the river would say, well, I had the free agency to go around the rock, and the mountain didn't tell me to do this. But actually, you know, the physics is guiding it every single step of the way.
You know what I mean? Okay, and that's why a Buddhist would just say, just surrender to the river because you have no free agency or something like that.
Right.
Well, I don't know if it's entirely that, because I could still attempt to swim upstream even if it wears me out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like there's kind of like we have this subjective sense that we can kind of like play with the variables, right? It's like inside our brains, we've got like maybe there's like 5 things that we desire at the same time. It's like I want some ice cream, I want to diet, I want to play video games, I want to be productive with doing my homework, and I want to sleep. It's like I've got these, and I have to go to the bathroom. Like I want to do all these things simultaneously. And then as you're thinking, you're like, well, which one do I want the most? Because I can only do one at a time. So you're like trying to measure each of them. But the thing is, when you're measuring all of these, that's like the river doing an algorithm. So like in a program, like there's a for loop and it's like processing data. And so you've got like this electronic looping of like, how important is going to the bathroom? How important is homework? How important is being productive? Yeah. And you're measuring all of these things just like a river going through an algorithm. And then you eventually come up with, actually, video games are most important because I really need some dopamine. And then you go do that, right?
Okay. So I can definitely see how we have limited free will where we are, but is it possible for us to break the boundaries of what is impossible for us in any way, or are we just forever going to be subject to the river?
Are you saying, is it possible for our brains to defy the laws of physics inside of our brains?
The way you put it like that, probably no, because our brains were created by the laws of physics, right?
Yeah, and I would think that neuroscience would be able to measure, like if there's calcium ions going through the rivers of our brain, and they're scanning all of this activity, and if they like see like this ion doing like it's violating the laws of physics, you'd think they would measure that, and they're like, wow, this just violated, the force equation. That should be empirically detectable. You know
Sure.
what I mean?
All right.
Yeah.
So I want to bring up one more thing, and then we'll move on to another subject. Michio Kaku, a great famous physicist, his argument. I want to bring up his argument for free will.
Okay.
Is that in that you can't know what a particle is going to do. It's so random and chaotic that Einstein said God doesn't play dice, doesn't play with dice.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
there's sort of this idea that because particles are so random and spontaneous, because there's some chaos within this order, within the ordered river, that means there is some particles of free will.
Yeah, I think I've it took me about a year or 2 years to like I came to this concept with a free will bias because Mormonism gave me a free will bias.
Right.
And so as I was deconstructing as an agnostic to an atheist, I iterated through a lot of these same arguments. And so I think there's two strong arguments against the quantum argument for free will. The first argument is that randomness is not equal to free will. So that's a non sequitur, basically. It doesn't do what you want it to do. And the other argument is the brain. So the brain produces your decisions, and the brain operates at this neural connectivity layer of abstraction. So this is a macroscopic structure. Quantum randomness is very microscopic. Quantum randomness has an influence that's about the size of an atom. So if you're going to say how effective is quantum randomness at manipulating stuff, it can only manipulate stuff in a tiny little volume. And since the decisions operate at this macroscopic brain structure level, quantum randomness isn't a large enough in scope to change your decisions at that level of analysis.
All right, fair enough. So would it be if we have no free will, right? What's the point of living?
Yes.
Let's be metaphysical.
That's the next question. Like once you get to this point, that's part of my philosophic approach. We got to build some things here in this void. So I think from my perspective, the best approach is this sentientism approach where well-being is important. So even if free will doesn't exist, well-being does exist, right? Even so for example, we could build a robot. We could build two types of robots, right? One robot has the ability to suffer, and the other robot is immune to suffering. It's just, void of feeling. Well, once we create a robot that can suffer, suddenly this is an important creation. Like we need to treat it nicely because suffering is horrible. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so the fact that the robot lacks free will doesn't change the importance of its sentience.
All right. So suffering is the idea. All right. So let's move on to the other side of the debate, the theistic side of the debate.
Okay.
What would you, from your point of view, what do you think is the strongest argument for theism?
I'm perfectly fine answering this, but I'm curious if you would want to answer it since you occupy the theist position, right?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I think the strongest argument for atheism is, as I explained, the bicameral mind, because it perfectly explains where the idea of God came from and how it helped us to evolve to where we are today. Personally, I think for me, the greatest argument for God is what I call the metaphorical God hypothesis. So
metaphorical, okay.
Yeah. So the metaphorical God hypothesis goes, if we exist here and now, and we are capable, and our future descendants are capable of transcending this reality to escape the heat death of the universe to, let's say, a higher plane of existence, they would be looking down on us right now. But if they are not looking down on us right now, then it's impossible for us to escape our current situation, and we will die in the heat death.
You're going to need to say that one more time.
So maybe it's a little bit more of sort of like a hopeful idea, hopeful belief. But the way that I do it is I bring it down to the level of, let's say, somebody who doesn't believe in a God.
Mm-hmm.
I take this sort of like there was once this one interview once asked what's his name, the most famous atheist of our time right now. I totally forgot his name. He's the biologist guy.
Oh, Richard Dawkins?
Richard Dawkins, yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know why I was skipping out his name, but he was in this interview where he was asked the question, how could a god reasonably come about? And he said, well, I suppose it could come about like this, like that a certain species on a certain planet evolved to a certain state, that they created such amazing technologies to be magical that they managed to escape their predicament and go into higher dimensions.
Okay.
Kind of an idea. And so that sort of follows suit with what I'm talking about with this metaphorical God hypothesis, that it's sort of this hopeful idea that we can escape the heat death of our universe. And if we can, our descendants would be looking down on us right now because they have transcended this dimension.
Why would you use the term metaphorical? Did someone else coin it that way?
No, that's sort of how I coined it, because in a way, because it's sort of getting somebody to look at it from a metaphorical point of view. Yes, that metaphorically there are these humans that transcend reality and become gods themselves, and then they can look down on us and be guiding us along the way. Maybe they are the river, kind of an idea.
Oh, that seems a little bit different, but okay. I think this metaphorical God hypothesis, it's very similar to the argument that I would have wanted to say. So I think we're in very, very tight alignment.
So go ahead and explain that then.
Let me see if I can find how I wrote how I wrote it. So this is my formulation. I think this formulation it came from a discussion with my dad. So my dad is largely responsible for this formulation. So we called it the multiverse argument for God. So there is a high probability of many natural universes. That's the multiverse, right? All of these universes, and there's a high probability that some of these natural universes evolve intelligent beings. So, like they could be like these atheistic universes that evolve humans, right? And then there's a high probability that some of these intelligent beings evolve to the point of immortality. And then there's a high probability that some of these immortals evolve to godlike beings. And then you get the conclusion, therefore, there's a high probability that godlike beings exist at least somewhere in this multiverse.
Sure.
Right.
That's definitely the idea. I think the idea of the multiverse is, this is where we get into the idea of what would a universe look like with a god and what would a universe look like without a god. And I think there's a high probability that we could get the example of both out of the multiverse.
Yeah. So I agree, but I do have a challenge to the God hypothesis.
Sure. Well, that's where we start to get into, okay, we've established what could be the most probable idea for the existence of a god, and now what are the weaknesses of it?
Yeah, exactly. So for me, I view one. Okay, so agency, right? Agency as a philosophic concept. What is agency? Agency is basically goal-oriented behavior and action. So you can attribute agency to bacteria if they're hunting for food in their environment. It's like, oh, they've got a goal and they go do it, right? Now, humans are a more evolved agency where we have these complex goals and we pursue complex goals, right? So a god would have divine agency, and agency in this context, the god would have his own goals, right? And so if the god has his goals and he has power to accomplish his goals, you should be able to measure the effect of God's agency on reality, right? And so if you measure reality, you should be able to detect patterns of God influencing things to affect his goals. And so if we find a pattern that shows a goal, a divine goal being accomplished, then that's evidence for God. And if we can't find any patterns of divine goals being affected, then where's the God?
So as far as you can tell, you haven't seen this divine pattern yet.
Well, in my believing years, I thought I saw it, but now in retrospect, I feel like I wasn't analyzing the data correctly. I was very biased in my analysis of the data. And I think in unbiased analysis, it seems more like there's no pattern. It's more like random.
All right. Definitely. So let's get into that idea of what would a universe with a God look like? What kind of patterns would be laid out?
Yeah. I did an exegesis on the book of Job where I went in greater than normal detail on this question. I reviewed it for this discussion. No. Well, what do you mean?
Because Carl Jung wrote a book called Answer to Job, where he really got into depth on all that on Job.
Yeah. I've listened to that before, but I did a separate analysis of the book of Job for myself.
Okay, so go on.
And so my analysis was basically like Job is addressing the problem of evil, right? He's like, I'm suffering from all this evil stuff. Why? If there's a good God, why me? Why this? Right?
Sure.
And so I'm analyzing this with Job in this narrative, in this work. And what my thoughts are is, if this life is supposed to be a test, then it should look something like a test. And I think I can envision a test that's a lot better than this test, right? If we're comparing, like, we can imagine all these different types of universes, and we can judge which of them are good tests and which are bad tests. I would say this universe functions as a bad test, and I can imagine better types of testing universes. Does that make sense?
Okay. Like, you think that the problem of evil is too great that it just looks like there isn't any kind of tests going on.
Well, so like, if you wanted to use suffering as a teaching mechanism, then what you should do is you should design the suffering to match the test. It should be very, very tight coupling. If you mess up in this way, you get this suffering, and like, it's all tied together very nicely. But in this universe, none of the suffering seems tied super tightly. It seems like people get sick for random reasons. They didn't do anything wrong. Someone gets injured and they go to Iraq, they lose their legs. Like, what did they do to justify that suffering? Like, there's a lot of excessive, gratuitous suffering that isn't tightly coupled to a valid reason. And the reason should be of equivalent. So the suffering should match the reason. And if you're teaching your kids, you shouldn't use excessive suffering to teach your kids to begin with. If you have a 2-year-old, do you have any kids? I don't know.
No, I am so single. It's not even a.
Well, that makes 2 of us.
Okay. I guess I could say, if God was real, I'd be married by now.
So
there would be this perfect woman waiting for me.
Oh, yes.
I mean, maybe. I still try to be a naively optimistic, hopeful person, but
wow, you seem like you got a good chance for you. Keep at it.
Thanks.
But basically, what I'm appealing to here is, like, if you have a 2-year-old, your 2-year-old doesn't understand how or why to avoid the fire. So if you're teaching your child, do you think the correct approach is to, like, stick their hand in the fire, let the 2-year-old, their hand catches on fire, and like, aha, now you learned, don't touch fire, ha ha ha. Like, that's a horrible lesson. Like, that's a horrible teaching mechanism, right? A good parent doesn't use excessive suffering. You use the minimal necessary suffering to accomplish the lesson. And it seems like this world is using excessive suffering, and you can't find the lesson.
Okay. I guess this is where Latter-day Saints would take an interesting approach. I talk about this in one of my videos where I don't think we can entirely blame God for the problem of evil, which is why I say yes, and it's not God's problem, it's our problem, because we are the ones who had free agency coming out of the premortal realm. We are the ones who assisted Jesus Christ in creating the earth. So in a way, we are part responsible. We are the imperfect gods who created this imperfect world. So it's our mess to clean up.
Yeah, that's one way to think of it. We're responsible for the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But
like, I think it's a hopeful idea in general, because it means we can't. It puts our mind towards suffering, and it makes us think, how can I help to improve what's going on in this world?
So, am I clear in understanding you're saying that our premortal spirits designed a world with suffering, and therefore we are deserving of the suffering that we designed?
Well, I think part and partially because we are the anguish of an imperfect God. We are the ones that came down here. We are the ones that, and regardless of how it came about, whether or not I think ultimately, fundamentally, I would say, I mean, this is what the book of Abraham talks about, is that we talk about knowing suffering so we can learn to prize the good. But of course, sometimes the suffering extends a little bit too far, to the point that it gets a little bit unfair. Say, like, why children that die young, or like maybe you suffer something and you don't learn anything and you just keep on in your own ways. I think one of the things that Carl Jung brings up in answer to Job, that he talks about how the fundamental idea of suffering is to keep us conscious. So you might say, it's unfair that I stubbed my toe, but because you stubbed your toe, you are now conscious of the fact that you need to be aware of your surroundings to not stub your toe again. Mm-hmm. And then so it makes you more, you could say it makes humans more, I would say, profound, because we suffer, because we live in an imperfect world, because we suffer, because we are made conscious of these terrible things that are happening in our world. It makes us responsible to act and correct the sort of situations that are happening. Like in answer to Job, he talks about how God was made conscious. He was originally unconscious, but then he was made conscious in his confrontation with Job, because he suddenly realized that he is putting unjust suffering on this man, and suddenly he wanted to relate to mankind, and that's why we got Jesus Christ, God incarnate, this being who wanted to come down and experience what it is like to be human.
Yeah. So I think that there's a good distinction to make between like moral lessons and like navigation lessons. Mm-hmm. Like when you're stubbing your toe, maybe you see, I don't see a moral lesson. I see a navigation lesson. It's like you need to navigate more carefully.
Well, right? I think morality is a very subjective term in general. I think maybe it could be moral to learn a navigational lesson.
So let me give my video game hypothesis, which I've written a bit about, which is
sure. That's what you talk about in your simulation video.
Yeah. Well, I think that a possible world would be more video game like. So if I was God, I could design a video game, and I could put my spirit children in a video game, and they could navigate the video game. Have you ever stubbed your toe in a video game and had suffering from a stub? No, you don't. That doesn't exist in video games.
Well, the only suffering I experience in video game is frustration that I can't beat this big boss.
Right. And so in the video game world, they subtract out all of the useless suffering. There's no hunger in video games because that's a waste of time. Like nobody needs that lesson. There's no stubbing your toes because nobody needs that. What lessons do you need to do? You need to learn how to accomplish your goals. And so if there are moral goals, you could have friends in the video game. And it's like, oh, you need to share your video game toys with your friends. And then you learn that lesson. And then like you need to, you could have moral lessons where you treat other characters like you want to be treated in the video game, but you can subtract away all the unnecessary suffering. You know what I mean?
All right, so Kafi just pointed out, as video games get more detailed, NPCs will be able to stub their toes. Do you think that's a possible reality or no? Video game characters will never be able to stub their toes.
No, yeah, I grant that it's a possibility, but it's a undesirable possibility.
Sure.
You like if you're designing a moral test, you would subtract away the fluff, and I would consider that fluff in terms of the test.
Okay. Okay, definitely. Another interesting thing you brought up in that simulation video is the idea that if somebody is creating a universe, let's say in a video game simulation, they wouldn't create so many empty planets. Like it's weird how only Earth is habitable.
Yeah, totally weird.
We try to go out to these other planets and we find they're empty.
Yep. That it doesn't make sense with simulation theory, and it doesn't make sense with theism, right?
Okay.
Do you remember my Isaiah argument for that?
Remind me.
There's a chapter and verse in Isaiah that Isaiah says, or God is speaking through Isaiah, and he says, the earth is not empty. I put inhabitants on the earth for a reason. I didn't create the earth in vain. I created the earth in order for it to be inhabited. And so God is exposing his goals, right? The divine agency, he's using his powers to affect his goal to create life on earth, right? He wants it to be inhabited. That's his goal.
Okay.
But then the contradiction is, why is God's goal limited to earth? Like if his goal is to keep earth inhabited, why not keep Mars inhabited? Why not keep Venus inhabited? Why not keep, you know what I mean? Like, why is his goal so narrow?
Sure, I could definitely see that. Mm-hmm. Though I guess a funny thing I was going to bring up is Starfield, where they do create tons of planets that are empty.
Yeah. That's it, I guess, that's a good counter argument. I guess if you really value exploration, and if you really value like I guess colonialism, like seeding other planets, but that seems more boring than spontaneous evolution on every planet, right?
So you wouldn't want a colonial god.
That seems less interesting than an unbiased god.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, Coffee is bringing in Red Dead Redemption 2. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, by the way. In Red Dead Redemption 2, it's possible for your horse to trip over a rock while you're riding along. Some games will add these details for a more realistic gameplay.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe sometimes it's interesting to add those details, but I usually get annoyed by those types of things in video games, but maybe some people like it. More power to you.
A lot of people get annoyed by breakable systems. Like in Breath of the Wild, people were really annoyed that their weapons kept breaking. And in other games, your clothes can break, and it's just like, holy crap. Why do I need that?
Yeah.
That's what happens in the Conan game.
Yeah.
And so exactly. I feel like there's a lot of like unnecessary inconveniences that can happen in video games, but at the same time, they present interesting problems that you need to create interesting solutions for.
Yeah, that's a good counter argument that the variety of problems creates a variety of heroic approaches to solve them, right?
Sure, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good argument.
All right, so let's start to let's start to run down some stuff here. Run down the things here. So what we mainly were talking about what could be the Hegelian unification between atheism and theism.
Yeah.
What do you think that looks like?
Great question. I do have thoughts on this. How familiar are you with Jordan Peterson's work?
I'd say I'm reasonably familiar. I've only read a little bit of his 12 Rules for Life book, but I've seen lots of podcasts and videos either talking about him or him talking about stuff. And I've seen some videos where they critique his view on Marx or Nietzsche or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I think I have a fairly decent understanding of Jordan Peterson. He's I think it's very weird how he's very strangely popular in Latter-day Saint circles in general. Like you have Jacob Hansen's whole Jordan Peterson teaching elders quorum series. That's very bizarre. Apparently he hasn't even picked up the Book of Mormon, but he's heard of it at least. But so yeah, that's my brief overview of Jordan Peterson.
Now, I did send you a link. Did you get a chance to read the bottom piece of the link on Jordan Peterson I sent you?
Yeah, I read how you talked about Jordan Peterson's God.
Yeah, exactly.
How it's sort of a little bit more of an in the air idea than like a physical. There's a big white bearded man in the sky kind of an idea.
Exactly. Jordan Peterson's definition of God as delineated, to me, that seems like the easiest way for atheists and theists to come to a compromise, right?
Okay.
Because all of the things that Jordan Peterson listed, an atheist could basically
about
say...
viewing God as the highest ideal, the highest ideal for mankind to strive for. The question then would be, what kind of attributes does this God have? Is it the God of the Bible? Is it one of the Hindu gods? Is it another God altogether? Or do we simply imagine a high ideal God for ourselves and strive for that?
Yeah. Jordan Peterson's idea of God is very vague, which might be beneficial to unifying multiple theisms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you might be able to get multiple religions and atheists to unify on this definition of God, which is what makes it such an interesting angle for dialectic.
And I think in a way that goes back into my metaphorical God hypothesis, where even if you're an atheist, you can still look at God in a metaphorical sense, that maybe there are humans that transcended the third dimension to go to the fourth or fifth dimension, to the point where time is no longer a thing and they can just look down on all of reality.
Yeah, it's hypothetically possible.
And I think there's still something to be said about being naively hopeful or naively optimistic for those kinds of things. For the idea that we can escape specifically the heat death of the universe.
Yeah. I empathize with that a lot, actually. I mentioned that how I like to be constructive and like build things.
Mm-hmm. Better to build things than to tear people down and be like, oh, well, sucks to be you.
And so on this note, like the exact note you're talking about, I have a side project where I'm building a Neo-Mythology that addresses that exact concept. It addresses the multiverse theory of gods, where it posits that there are gods in the multiverse, and they do survive the heat death, it's a deism to where they're not super involved with this universe, right? Like they help create this universe, but they're kind of hands off. They don't have enough power to help out. And so it solves the problem of evil when the gods have no power. They just like wish you the best.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of an alternative mythology to kind of approach these issues, right?
Sure. Well, I hope you let me know when you publish those series of novels.
Yeah, it's a slow work in progress.
I myself have been thinking about that idea of creating this sort of this series of novels or a show or something like that that sort of explores how a world could come about by a god and what kind of things would he be implementing. But it looks like Coffee is bringing up a couple of extra things about Jordan Peterson. I think the perennial philosophy might best depict Jordan Peterson's grasp of God is a kind of metaphysical truth which may underline all the world's major religions. That all the world's major religions point to a single metaphysical truth despite their differences and seeming contradictions.
That was a lot. Do you want to reread that?
So I think basically what Kafi, however you pronounce your name, please tell me if I'm saying that right, is pointing out is that it sort of goes back to an idea that I mentioned in one of my videos, how at one moment how Latter-day Saints know, where I mentioned the Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. And I sort of talk about how all religions are sort of just imperfect versions of one unifying truth, that they all have truths in them, whether you're atheist or theist, whether you're Buddhist or Hindu or Shinto or whatever, that they all combine, they all can be the truth parts of them, at least what's useful, can be combined into one, and at least should be combined into one unifying religion or theory.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to think of it, and perhaps a useful way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely what it seems like the more I study the history of religion and mythology in general, is it seems like everything just spread out from these core central ideas. Like there's this idea of the Indo-European god called Deus Jupiter, where you get the idea of Jupiter and Zeus, but also he sort of just represents this idea of this great father, conquering father coming in and conquering all of these mother-based tribes. And sort of this is where they put in man as the dominant head figure and sort of an idea. And this is where you get, the God of the Bible, where he's going around conquering people, and he's just kind of assimilating all of them. And so especially when you look at the history of Yahweh, how he used to be a part of a pantheon of gods. He wasn't just this single, he's the all-powerful creator of the universe. And so really the more I study religion, the more I'm pretty much convinced that at one point there was this one core unifying religion. Maybe it wasn't totally perfect, but it was unifying, at least that it encompasses all of these ideas of the collective unconscious. And that's why so many thousands or millions of years later, I'm not entirely sure on the time frame, years later, we still have these ideas in the back of our minds, in the back of the collective unconscious.
Yeah, that seems fair. I have an atheistic way of looking at it, but yeah, I think both perspectives. See, that's the interesting thing about the Jordan Peterson perspective, is that both the theists and the atheists can basically agree this seems like a fair interpretation or a fair approach, right?
Right. And so Coffee's also bringing in, basically in a nutshell, it's a transcendent metaphysical truth which exists independently of and unaffected by time or place, but yet which all religions point towards.
That would be the theistic way of looking at it, I would say.
Sure.
But the atheistic way of looking at it would be it's just evolutionary psychology, it's game theory, it's like it's convergent strategy. It's like there's two different groups that are trying to figure out how to cooperate, and it's like, oh, love your neighbor is how we cooperate, and the golden rule, like all of these different groups are all converging on the golden rule is how you cooperate. And they got different phraseologies, but it's the same strategy. You know what I mean?
Sure, definitely. All right. So I think that that's a pretty good conclusion right there. Is there anything else you want to add into the conversation?
Yeah, that was pretty good. Yeah, I was wondering if we wanted to go through Jordan Peterson's definition, but that might be
Sure.
better for another time.
We could go into that a little bit more. Sure. I wouldn't
think?
mind extending this out a little bit more.
Yeah, it seems since we were talking about so much, we might as well dig into it a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you want me to pull it up on sharing my screen, maybe?
Sure. Do I have to give you permission to share your screen or something? Or I'm still pretty new to this software.
So where is it? Okay, I am hitting share. Did that work? Okay, it popped up?
Yep, here we go.
Okay. So this is a list that delineates the types of things that Jordan Peterson attributes to God. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. Like an atheist can grant that, everyone has values, so that exists, right? God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time. An atheist can grant that we represent consciousness symbolically in stories. That exists. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchies of men. Natural selection, any atheist can grant that exists. God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. This is basically like psychological transformation. That
sounds
exists.
Like the atonement. He died and is reborn.
So yeah, you could play with your interpretation. So you could take a theistic interpretation or an atheistic one, right?
Either way, there's symbolic value in it.
Exactly. You get the value whether you do the theistic route or the atheistic route of interpretation.
Okay.
God is the future to which we make sacrifices. Yeah, an atheist could grant that. A theist could grant that.
Sure.
Right? God is the voice of conscience, right? That the Holy Spirit or psychology, like Jungian collective evolutionary conscience. You know what I mean? That's God is a source of judgment, mercy, and guilt. Like atheists could grant that those exist. God is that which calls and responds in the eternal call to adventure. That's a kind of a tricky one to understand, but
sure, the call to adventure. I mean, I'm reading. That's probably in reference to Joseph Campbell's book, Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he talks about how all ancient myths are part of the collective unconscious that calls us to adventure.
Right. Yeah. So like evolution could give you an impulse to adventure, or God is inspiring you, right?
Sure.
But you get the emphasis on adventure regardless. God is the spirit trying to elevate being, right? You can kind of think of that naturalistically or religiously.
Okay.
God is the spirit that makes everything come together. That's yeah, you can go both ways on all of these.
Yeah.
God is the spirit that makes order out of chaos and recasts it into order when it becomes too limiting. So that could be this collective impulse for society, for unity, for evolution, getting order out of chaos, right?
Right. Okay.
And God is the spirit of truth incarnate. So when we love truth, we are embodying divinity, right?
Sure. It means you're acting godly when you speak the truth, when you learn about the truth.
Exactly. So I think the issue with Jordan Peterson's definition, there's a theistic issue and an atheistic issue. The atheistic issue is, I can grant all of this stuff, but why are we using the word God? That seems superfluous. Why not just say evolution? Why not just say psychology? Why not just say unconscious, right?
Okay.
And I think the theistic issue, you can tell me what you think. My brother was saying, he thinks that the theistic issue is that these things reduce God. it's almost like these are lesser aspects of God, and God is more than just this stuff.
Okay.
Right? How do you feel about that?
I think it goes both ways. I think you could look at it, sure, you could say evolution is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. But at the same time, I don't know if evolution is about the highest values. I mean, evolution is more so just about survival of the fittest, and whoever has more babies than another person, kind of an idea is, and however they do it, whether they do it through rape, whether they pillage and plunder, if they're passing down their genes, that's all evolution really seems to care about. So I don't know if you can really say evolution is the highest value.
So I would think that you could, but that might take some discussion to go through. I don't know how much longer you want to discuss this.
Well, if you can do it real briefly.
Okay, so basically there's multiple strategies to maximizing your offspring, and you could hierarchically measure, is rape a good strategy? Is cooperation a good strategy? Is being a bully a good strategy? Is being an alpha male? Is being a CEO a good strategy? Is being a philosopher a good strategy? Yeah, there's all of these different options.
I mean, most of the philosophers I read, they're not passing down their genes. They're all incels, I guess you could say.
You could say that.
So I think that's my biggest problem getting into philosophy. It's made me too much of an incel.
But the problem is your scope of analysis. If you only look at passing on your genes at the individual level, you're missing passing your genes on at the collective level. What if societies that have a higher philosopher ratio succeed better, and societies with less philosopher ratios go extinct, right?
Sure.
So maybe sprinkling in a couple incels helps the stability of the whole system. You know what I mean?
Maybe.
And so it's an open question. What is the highest value? And so evolution is experimenting. It's saying, oh, and so each human, I would say each human is our genetic code is probably a chimerical genetic code. And what I mean is, I think that everyone has a possibility of giving birth to a philosopher. They have a possibility of giving birth to a CEO. Yeah. There's different genes that turn on and off different desires. You know what I mean?
But simply put, it's about focusing on the collective than the individual. And I think in general, yeah, we could say that it is the highest value so long as either God is real or we are working to make God a reality, kind of an idea. Are we evolving upwards or are we devolving?
God, so highest value is like a placeholder, and the theists put God there. But then you have to think, what does God mean when it's in this spot, right? And so the definition of God changes across theologies, right?
Sure. Okay.
So is God of war the highest value? Is God of well-being the highest value? Is God of patriotism the highest value? You know what I mean?
Sure. Okay.
Is God of sacrifice, God of obedience? Like, which thing is the best thing for society?
Right. And then I think I could also throw in maybe the idea of God, whether or not you believe in God or not. I think maybe the idea of God simply puts a more sacred aspect to it. For example, saying like in Shinto religion, trees have spirits instantly makes you want to respect trees more than go around and chopping down a whole forest.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair from an evolutionary standpoint, I think. You know what I mean?
Okay. So yeah, I think it definitely goes both ways.
As in, from a theist perspective, you're not sure why.
You can put God or evolution or whatever you want in that spot, what matters is maintaining that highest value. I don't care if it's evolution or God.
Okay. Okay. Sure. So do you think theists would feel like this subtracts essence from God? It reduces him to something less impressive?
By simply confining him to these specific ideas?
Yeah.
I think maybe, especially for Mormons who believe that God is an embodied person who like is very physical. He's not like the God of the Protestants who lacks body parts and passions.
Mhm.
For our idea of God, it's always very physical, very, very much a reality. And I think there is something to be said about that, because it means that God is just like us. He suffers with us. He understands us, kind of an idea. And so I think for a Latter-day Saint, it kind of does reduce God a little bit. But if we're taking it from the position of an atheist, I think this is the best that we're going to get. I think as an atheist, if this is all you're focusing on, you're not focusing on whether or not God has a body. You're not focusing on whether or not he is our literal parent. I think this totally can work for you.
Yeah. There's a growing movement of Christian atheists who kind of adopt Jordan Peterson's
I know.
paradigm.
I've heard Slavoj Žižek talk about that a little bit, and
Yeah.
I kind of disagree with him here and there. But I think one interesting idea he does point out is when Jesus was on the cross and he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That was Jesus being an atheist. And I think, okay, yeah, I could kind of see that. It's sort of like he's experiencing what it's like to be an atheist. He's experiencing what it's like to look up in the sky and say, there is no God. Because he felt so abandoned in that singular moment. And so I think there could be some truthfulness to that. I'm not totally, jazzed about atheist Christianity, but I think if that's the closest to Christianity an atheist can get, then that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Now, do you think that for a theist, if a theist is concerned that this reduces God too much, I think, tell me if this works or not, you could say that these are the minimum aspects of God. And so God is at least this stuff, and then maybe God is more in addition. And that maybe that can kind of help them accept this paradigm.
Yeah, probably. So I think if Jordan Peterson's God is definitely the closest thing that you can get to an atheist like yourself can get to a belief in God, then yeah, that's fine. That's good enough with me. I think that could be, in general, the ultimate conclusion of what is an theist look like.
Right. It's kind of adopting the evolutionary benefits of religion and contextualizing them naturally.